It was the night after his final concert, where the world's biggest stars had gathered to honor Jay-Z's legacy, rising from Brooklyn streets to a throne of wealth, fame, and power. Few knew the dark secrets lurking beneath his success. That night, after the applause faded, Jay-Z drove back to his mansion, haunted by recent accusations. Whispers of an old affair and betrayal echoed in his mind, secrets catching up despite being tightly wrapped in silence. His phone buzzed with a message from an anonymous number. "You can't outrun what you've done." Jay-Z glanced at the screen, gripping the wheel tightly. He didn't respond, his breath quickening. The mansion loomed ahead, its dark silhouette cutting into the moonless sky. As he entered the sprawling estate, a shiver crawled up his spine. The house felt different tonight. The lights flickered momentarily as he crossed the threshold, pausing to narrow his eyes at the chandelier. The first weird thing. In his study, the floorboards creaked unnaturally. The room seemed colder, and the bookshelf, his personal collection of memories, was out of place. Someone had moved the books, rearranging them in an unsettling pattern. Scanning the titles, his stomach tightened. The books were all his albums, each spine a chapter of his life. But one was missing. The cover of Reasonable Doubt, his debut album, had disappeared. He shook his head, brushing it off as a trick of the mind. As he turned around, the portrait on the wall of his younger self seemed to stare back at him with cold eyes. His face wasn't right, too pale, too lifeless. "It's just the stress," he told himself. But as the hours wore on, Jay-Z couldn't shake the feeling that the mansion itself was alive, breathing in the silence, its walls closing in around him. The next morning, the accusations grew louder, tying him to a shadowy past, a crime, a betrayal from his early music industry days. People said he had sacrificed a friend for his rise to stardom. A rumor, sure, but there was too much smoke for there not to be fire. Jay-Z locked himself in his office, the weight of the allegations like a crushing pressure in his chest. He stared at the empty chair across from him, remembering the days when that chair had been occupied by his old business partner, the one who had vanished without a trace. The past crept in, no matter what he did. The second weird thing. There was a tapping at the door. At first, he thought it was his security, but when he opened it, there was no one there. Only a faint smell of cologne, one that he hadn't worn in years. His old friend's scent, the very one he had tried to forget. As if the very ghost of the man had returned to torment him. He shook it off and sat back down at his desk, trying to focus, trying to forget the past. Later that evening, he received an invitation, a gathering at an old underground club, the kind of place he used to frequent before he became a star. The invitation was cryptic, the kind that seemed like it was meant for someone else. The note was simple. "You know what you did. Come alone." The club was hidden deep within Brooklyn, far from the glimmer of wealth and city lights. Jay-Z's car rolled to a stop in front of an abandoned building. The air was thick with decay, and the streetlights flickered like dying embers. Inside, the club smelled of stale whiskey and cigarettes. The walls were dark, covered in graffiti that spoke of forgotten times. A piano played softly in the corner, the keys being struck by invisible hands. The moment he entered, the people turned, their eyes cold, hollow. They were all watching him. At the far end of the room, a figure stood in the shadows, illuminated by the dim glow of the bar lights. The third weird thing. It was him, his own face, staring back at him from a mirror. But this version was older, more sinister, with hollow cheeks and dark circles under the eyes. It was a reflection of a man who had been consumed by guilt. "Jay-Z," a voice called from behind. He spun around, his pulse quickening. The man who had spoken was wearing an old suit, his face hidden in the darkness. "Do you remember me?" the voice asked. The memory hit him like a wave. This man, he had been his partner, the one who had vanished, the one who was now standing before him, alive. "You're dead," Jay-Z whispered. The man smiled. "Am I?" The night dragged on as Jay-Z faced his demons in that darkened room. One by one, the people from his past, people he thought he had left behind, appeared. A former lover, a colleague he had betrayed. Each person looked at him with those same accusing eyes. Faces twisted in pain, and each one whispered the same thing. "You know what you did." As Jay-Z stumbled back, the walls seemed to close in. The voices grew louder, filling his mind with accusations, with memories that he could no longer escape. The fourth weird thing. A loud crash echoed through the club. A figure in a black hoodie standing in the shadows dropped a file onto the floor. The file was thick with documents, his life, his crimes, all laid bare. He flipped it open, his heart sinking as he saw a photograph of his old friend, the one who had disappeared. But in the photo, the man's eyes were wide open, staring into the lens, a smirk playing at his lips. The words underneath read, "You never escaped." By the time Jay-Z left the club, his mind was unraveling. The air outside was heavy with fog, the streets eerily empty. His car wouldn't start. Desperate, he began to walk, the weight of his past pressing down on him. The fifth weird thing. As he walked through the empty streets, he heard footsteps behind him, not his own. He turned sharply, but there was no one there. His breath quickened and he turned again, the feeling of being watched gnawing at him. Suddenly, a voice broke the silence. "You can't run from the truth." The voice was soft but chilling. Jay-Z's breath caught in his throat. He turned around to face the speaker, himself. The man standing before him was identical in every way. But there was something in his eyes that didn't belong. A coldness, a hunger, the reflection of everything Jay-Z had buried inside of him. "I thought you were gone," Jay-Z stammered. The doppelganger smiled. "You can't bury the past, Jay. It always finds you." The man stepped forward, and Jay-Z staggered back, his heart pounding, the world spinning around him. And then, with a sudden, jarring clarity, everything came crashing down. The face he saw in the mirror was not just an echo of his past. It was the one thing he could never escape, his own guilt. The man who had disappeared wasn't dead. He had been murdered by Jay-Z himself in the early days, a cold and calculated sacrifice for power. All of the whispers, the allegations, every twisted memory were the manifestations of a guilt too deep to be buried, a debt that could never be paid. In the silence that followed, Jay-Z understood the truth. He had never escaped the past. It had followed him all along. And now there was no turning back. The mansion, the accolades, the fame, all of it was built on a foundation of lies and betrayal. Jay-Z stood there, the weight of his actions pressing down on him like a physical force. The past had finally caught up, and there was no escaping it. The truth was out, and the world would soon know. As he looked around, the shadows seemed to close in, a reminder that the past never truly stays buried.